Hello and welcome to another edition of the RevOps Lab podcast. Our guest today is Jeremy Donovan from Insight Partners. And with me, I also have Yannis. Hello.
Hey there. Thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, yeah, great to have you. Great to have you both. Yannis, a frequent guest on the show again in recent times. So it's good. It's good to have you.
It feels good to be back.
I know.
I love the multi-person podcast also because then it's kind of more interesting, and I listen to a lot of podcasts. So the ones with a small little party going on sometimes are more fun. Often are more fun.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think particularly for today's topic, we want to talk about territory planning. I have to admit, right, I haven't done a territory planning myself. Yannis has. So I think it's good to have him on. Obviously, I can try to ask like the good questions and smart questions around it. But ultimately, I will fall short. So yeah, I'm glad to have that backup. Yeah, a quick introduction, maybe. So Jeremy, actually, you have quite a impressive resume, I think. Currently, you are Executive VP of Revenue Operations and Strategy at Insight Partners. You basically are on the advisory side, helping founders and companies to succeed in building like a successful revenue engine. I think that's great. You're an adjunct professor at Chicago CRO program at the University of Chicago. I think that is to say. You do have a background in engineering and data science. I think your last data science degree you attained actually just very recently, which I thought was...
I got a little bored during COVID, so I did an online degree through the University of Virginia.
Of course. Who doesn't? Who doesn't?
With grown, I'm old, so with grown children, you gotta keep yourself occupied. It's my wife, 3 cats, and then I fish a lot. So when I'm not involved with family or cats or fishing, it's usually something sales or data related.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, I think it's really good. And I think you also have a strong background, right? So in the past, so SVP Revenue Strategy at SalesLoft. That's obviously like a big company everyone knows for sure. And then another big company, I think, sort of like where you came up professionally was Gartner, where you spent more than 16 years. And in the end, your last role there was Group VP for marketing. Anything I forgot? Anything you want to add to it?
You got the broad brushstrokes. Definitely, I think from that you can glean that I tend to skew much more towards the analytical side of the types of job functions, and that 16 years at Gartner afforded me the ability to go through every imaginable job, right, across product, marketing, sales, the delivery, so pricing, packaging, you name it. I got a chance to do little bits and pieces of a million things. So try to bring all that together for the latter part of my career here on revenue strategy and operations.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it must have been a super interesting journey for sure. But before we dive into today's topic, like one other thing I spotted on your CV was actually like you have a degree in electrical engineering. So just curious about the transition from like university to Gartner, like how that happens and how you like from electrical engineering move into these marketing revenue roles.
Yeah, it is a great question. There's not too many of us floating around out there. Similarly, like I do see some people who went to law school, right, who become sales leaders or revenue operations leaders. So I thought I knew I'll give you the fastest possible version, I guess, but I thought I knew what I wanted to do when I was 10 years old, which was to be an electrical engineer. I didn't know any electrical engineers, so I have no idea how I got that in my head. I think I just like to take apart alarm clocks and train sets and stuff like that. So I went to school for electrical engineering, focused on semiconductor physics, worked in the semiconductor industry briefly before going over to Gartner. And I went through this progression of, I'll call it add a word, drop a word. So went from being a semiconductor engineer, dropped engineer, and then semiconductor analyst. Dropped the semiconductor piece, and I was more of a broad analyst, but also working on product development. Dropped the analyst thing, product development. Dropped development, product marketing, dropped product, corporate marketing, and then eventually dropped marketing and became, sales and marketing, dropped marketing, and then, moved into just pure revenue strategy and operations because as one of the CROs I work for figured out about me, and I think he was right on. He said, "Hey, you love to work on the business, not in the business." The distinction being like on the business is what is the roadmap? What do we need to get done over the course of the next, whatever, 12 to 24 months? And yeah, there are some near-term things, but it's really about planning and executing strategy. The in the business is the deals, and
Yep.
I know plenty of reps who love the thrill of the deal and learn and get really smart and great on that. I don't have the passion, so therefore I don't think I'm particularly good at the art of the deals.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I can
Perfect.
so much actually relate on that. I think as a founder, you always have this discussion around like working on the business versus in the business, and you're constantly oscillating between the two.
Yes.
Like you go very deep, very operational, and then you have to zoom out and actually think about the holistic thing and you're building. And I think that's, feels like, especially building the revenue factory, the revenue engine, however you want to call it, right, is very similar. And I love this description for RevOps, actually, because I think that is so, like, it's such a big debate, but it's not our topic today. I'll jump out here. Philip, please continue. Otherwise, this goes totally off track.
We can talk a lot about that topic also. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, good. I mean, let's kick it off with I think more like a broad approach, just to maybe you could, in your own words, just describe what territory planning is to you and why it is important, why it is relevant, why it's a thing RevOps should think about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess starting from the end goal and working backwards, territory planning matters because at the end of the day, you want the highest percentage of reps to meet or exceed quota. Because if they're not, you may have too much sales capacity. And, these days, right, it's all about efficient growth. So you're going to struggle with efficiency. If you go backwards from that, right, there's a whole bunch of steps that it takes and a whole bunch of decisions and philosophies that you need to follow in order to make sure that reps have, and we're going to talk about I'm going to talk more about account-based approaches here. There are certainly approaches to territory where you say, hey, you have these 5 zip codes and you need to go after those, like a geographic approach, or you have this vertical market and we're not going to tell you which accounts, but you go kind of find them. This is what I think we're going to talk about, the more common thing here, which is account assignment. So that all starts with finding ICP accounts, and then we can work our way through to some of the more technical and analytical pieces as we go through.
So is there a common territory planning approach or framework you can recommend, something you have in your mind and you can share with the audience?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been historically pretty DIY about this, partly because territory planning is an intensive but intermittent thing, right? You might do that once a year for enterprise. You might do that usually no more than twice a year, every 6 months for SMB. So therefore, strategy is people, process, and technology. I think since this is intermittent and doable, right, on a spreadsheet or using a little bit of code, which has been my approach, I think I don't necessarily think you need software to be able to do this. So, for me, the whole thing starts with figuring out what your ICP is. And I take given my background in engineering and statistics, I take a super analytical approach to that, which is the following. I want to, for any given account, so let's say, I have a universe of accounts, however many it is, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, whatever. You can get lists of accounts with great data. That's not a problem. What I'm going to then do is I'm going to look, assuming I'm not super early stage and just don't have any data, what I'm going to do, we can talk about the super early stage separately, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at, of the accounts that are in our CRM, what's the probability that account became an opportunity? I'm not even going to look at wins, because wins may be a less signal, but just to even become an opportunity is significant. So, and that gives me a bigger sample size. to figure out whether they've become an opportunity or not, there's a bunch of both, I'll call them more static. If I say static, I'll sometimes say that, but I'll call it more static, and then more dynamic types of things. So the more static things are, I'm going to look at firmographics, right? Is the probability that we get an opportunity with an account a function of company size, a function of geography, of industry, of whether they're public or private or federal or state and local or whatever. So there's maybe other firmographic factors, but those things obviously tend to be a little bit more static, right? Companies may grow and they may move from different size bands to the other, but the headquarters geography is not changing. The industry is not changing. Maybe they go from private to public, but that stuff tends to not change. So that's kind of the most common piece. I also like to look at technographic pieces, especially for SaaS, the SaaS industry. And there could be both positive and negative factors. So by way of example, that's in the last place I was at, we sold sales software to salespeople. It's a bit of a tongue twister. And there were positive technographic factors like, do they have, a certain CRM like Salesforce, right? Or Microsoft Dynamics or HubSpot or whatever, right? And then there also turned out to be negative factors as well. I recall from that, if a company had a consumer grade web host, like a GoDaddy or a HostGator or One-on-One, if they had one of those consumer grade hosts, that was actually a negative factor for us because it was obviously correlated with size, but it was a signal that, that they wouldn't be a fit. Or if they had more retail, like if they had Shopify, right? Probably at that time, not a great fit. That might have changed in years. But so the technographic factors I would also describe as more stable. The stuff then, the rest of the stuff tends to be a little bit more dynamic, right? So 2 categories of dynamic factors that can go into your account score about whether or not you're able to get an opportunity with a particular account. So one is intent, and then the other one is, I'll call it triggers. On the intent side, people are most familiar with first party and third party intent. So first party is stuff like they came to your website and they visited and you were able to resolve their identity, or they did a demo request, or they downloaded content, they attended a webinar, right? Like any of that is to me first party intent. Some better than others. Obviously a demo request much better than a content download. And third party is they're bouncing around on review sites, right? Searching, visiting other third party websites, the usual dark funnel stuff. There's also second party, which is maybe they're engaging with one of your reseller or referral partners, and you have a system that's able to link those. So that could be quite dynamic, and therefore your score could change. And I think some of the companies, there are a handful of companies out there who have dynamic scoring for accounts. It tends to be you do the account assignment in a batch, right? Like whatever that is, annually for enterprise or every 6 months for SMB. But maybe within a rep's territory, you can rebalance the territory based on intent. So you're not moving accounts in and out necessarily, but you're elevating the priority of the account for that rep on that day based on the intent. And the other, and I'll pause in a second, is triggers. And triggers are quite popular right now. I'll give you a side story in a second, but that's stuff like job changes or M&A or funding or hiring. On the trigger side, this week actually, I got an email from somebody, because my title doesn't exactly say what I do. My title implies I work in revenue strategy and operations for a regular SaaS company, but in actuality, I'm now an advisor to our portfolio companies. But I give reps the benefit of the doubt when they prospect me. My title says otherwise. So I got an email from somebody that said like, "Hey Jeremy, given that insert trigger, and it was one of our portfolio companies acquired a company. Are you interested in whatever it was, like sales compensation software?" And I was like, what in the world does one of our portfolio companies acquiring a company have anything to do with compensation management software? So I think the trigger stuff can go wrong. And I asked them, I can't really mention company names, but I asked them what tool they were using, and they did tell me what tool, and it's one of the popular like AI sales prospecting tools. So you can't. It's just a reminder that with the trigger stuff, you need to use it to augment and not replace the human, right? Like you got to look at that and ask yourself, does this actually make sense? Because if it doesn't, you're damaging your brand.
Okay, so this was quite a lot. So static, dynamic, right? Firmographic, technographic, and then on the dynamic side, basically the intent data, and then also triggers. I mean, your experience, any of those being superior? I mean, I understand that probably the most advanced company and the maturity, they combine all of those, right?
Yeah.
But what would you say is like table stakes, and what should you start with, and then what are the things that really have a big impact in your experience?
Yeah, if I had to narrow down from both the dynamic and then the static stuff, on the static side, in my experience, like probably company size is number one, and maybe geo number two. The technographic is a nice to have. I don't think it's like a critical need to have. That's polish. And then on the more dynamic side, maybe it's obvious, but I think first party intent and very specifically demo requests. Like to me, people talk about inbound and outbound. To me, the only real inbound is a demo request. I don't really think about anything else as being inbound, like a content download or a webinar attendee. To me, is like light intent. It's not an inbound, and is then suitable. That you could almost view as a trigger in and of itself, is like suitable for outbound prospecting to those people, but they're not ready. So I want to nurture everybody until, whether it's one-to-one or one-to-many, I want to nurture them with a call to action being to ultimately take a demo request, assuming that they're qualified.
Yeah.
The
yeah,
triggers. I was gonna say
sorry.
the jury's out on the triggers. Like, I think, yeah, I'm super skeptical about the triggers.
Yeah, I think it's also a lot like, right, I think there's like inbound versus outbound, right? If somebody books a demo, and to your point, if somebody downloads a gated content piece, right, like they can also go to your website and book a demo. Why didn't they book a demo? Probably they're not in market accounts actively looking. If you have an urgent problem, assume that you have a good positioning and messaging that people actually understand what you do, which sometimes can be an issue, I heard. But let's say they nailed that, right? Then they would come to your website, book a demo, and really try to solve it. And so I think there's a huge difference here, right, in terms of how you also plan your capacity against, those different aspects. Trigger. I mean, I'm super curious what you think. I mean, you're skeptical, but if you had to choose, what would you think? What trigger are you most excited about?
They're just so well. Part of it is that the triggers are so that, like, job changes or M&A or whatever is so intermittent. That's kind of problem one. Job change is probably the best trigger, but how often is there going to be a new CMO or CRO or CPO or CFO or whatever, whoever you're selling to? Like, I think it's intermittent. I think the other issue is like whether you could argue whether or not people can detect whether something was generated by an AI. But humans devalue repetition. So if every prospecting email you get references a job change, then you know that no effort was being put in, even if you don't know that a machine could do that. And you're going to ignore. Like, you ignore the common patterns. So that's the issue with triggers to me, is that it's not like unique enough. It's not valuable. There's no someone reminding me that whatever. Imagine I worked for a regular SaaS company and our CRO was replaced. Like, someone reminding me of that has no value. Whereas if someone prospects me with a good idea that I could implement, whether or not I buy their software, that's valuable, or shares really, really high quality benchmark data. I mean, I had someone prospect me recently, and they offered to give me this like exclusive benchmark report. And then I said, yeah, sure, I'd love to see it. So I was excited. And then I opened it up, and all it was a marketing fluff piece with no real benchmark data. I mean, that's not okay. right? So
yeah.
But there was a way. I mean, they got me interested, but then they blew it with garbage content.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things we do. We also have a salary benchmark report on revenue operations salaries, which we put a lot of work into getting with worldwide data and like more than 1,000 entries. So if you're interested, ping me on LinkedIn.
I would love, I would like that too. I mean, there's no end of demand. You know, we get a lot of demand for benchmarks of three kinds: operational benchmarks, so like regular KPIs; staffing benchmarks, what's the ratio of rep ops people to salespeople; and then compensation benchmarks, all super valuable.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah. So I think with like these different factors that you have to build like a proper scoring model, probably like heavily depends on the kind of like what kind of like company you are, right? Like, so for example, tech stack for us super relevant because we develop like a Salesforce solution. So if company doesn't have Salesforce, it's kind of like a hard pass. So probably massively depends, but really helpful with sort of like your prioritization. And once you then have like a model that you kind of like think works, like how do you then actually proceed to the next stage? What would be the next stage for you?
I think now here comes a philosophical question, which is, do I want to build equal potential territories or do I want to stack the deck? And the net is, I think you want to build equal potential territories within a segment. And I'll define a segment as however you've segmented your sales force. Let's assume it's SMB, mid-market, and enterprise. Like all SMB reps would get equal potential SMB account territory, all mid-market equal potential account territory, all enterprise. There's like an extreme version of Moneyball that one can play. I think it's playable in SMB, but not mid-market or enterprise. And my example of this is a few years ago, and I presume they still do it, but I'm not sure. I was talking to the head of revenue strategy and ops over at ZoomInfo, and they blew my mind with this philosophy of basically we're gonna give the best. They were very heavy inbound, so we're basically gonna give the best quality inbound leads to the best reps. And every quarter they tiered the reps into A, B, and C. And if you were in the bottom, this is rough, right? It's been a couple of years, I don't remember exactly, but if you were in the bottom 20% of tier A, then you moved down for the next quarter into tier B. And if you were in the top 20% of tier B for a given quarter, you'd move up. So from quarter to quarter, you could move up and down. So that philosophy of like, I'm going to give the best accounts to the best reps, you don't see a ton of that. But it definitely, there is like proof of life there. On that same philosophy, I was listening to a podcast earlier this week. It was Sam Blond on, I think it's called like the Go-to-Market Show or Go-to-Market Fund. I can't remember exactly what the name of the podcast was, but he talked about the fact that hiring incremental reps in a demand limited market can actually lower revenue. And it's a bit of a surprise, right? Because even if the marginal return is zero, it shouldn't lower the amount of bookings that you generate. But the problem is this thing about equal potential territories, right? Is like I've got a new rep and a tenured rep. And if I spread out the accounts equally, I'm going to give a bunch of accounts to a less tenured rep. And as a consequence, I'm going to have a lower win rate on an ICP or a non-ICP account. So it is actually mathematically, I went and built a spreadsheet around this because that's what I do. And mathematically, it's true. Like you actually could generate less bookings by doing this. But again, let's suspend disbelief. And philosophically, I think the best thing to do is like build equal potential territories and then just manage your reps accordingly. And you know, when you're oftentimes there's already account assignments. So one of the things I learned when I was first doing this, I called a bunch of people and said, hey, like, what are some of the best practices? And one of the best practices they said was reps are going to want to hold back a certain number of accounts where they have great opportunities, great relationships, even if there's not an opportunity, like whatever reason. And the advice was give them a certain number of accounts, maybe somewhere between 5 and 10, that you just don't ask questions about, that they are allowed to keep those accounts no matter what. So I did do that. I followed that advice and I thought that was, you know, super, super useful. Then there's a question about whether or not you keep an account with a rep based on whether they have an open opportunity at a certain stage, whether they've had significant activity, right? Because if they haven't had a meeting in, I don't know, 2 weeks, certainly,
Right.
or one on the calendar, or certainly no meeting in the last 4 weeks, like probably that op is dead. So, you just have to come up with a set of hard and fast rules that you can apply to then figure out which accounts to give out. And then the next bit, um, there's like other bits and pieces to it, but the next bit is then like, okay, if I've got 10 reps, I'm going to pick a rep, give them the best available account, cycle through that. Now I'm going to look at the whole base of reps. What's their sort of aggregate account score? And, probably you're probably snaking back and forth. Like the last person who got assigned an account in one wave is probably the first person who gets assigned in the next wave, so that you can continue to maintain equal potential territories for those reps.
When would you say you would assign an account? I mean, you just mentioned like 2 weeks, 4 weeks. I mean, what are the rules, and how does this differ by segment, SMB, mid-market, enterprise?
Yeah, there's the bigger thing, and I spoke to it a little bit before, which is I don't love to move accounts because there's so many but this, but that, right? So many exceptions of why maybe an op is maybe like an op has lost momentum, but it's not that the rep isn't doing anything in the account. So for me, I would say enterprise once a year, you're going to shuffle accounts. And for SMB, the maximum you could do it is quarterly. That's assuming you have a less than 90-day sales cycle pretty consistently. I don't like to move accounts more than once every 6 months. I will say, and I learned this also from one of the people I worked with, shuffling accounts does energize does juice bookings in two ways. One is obvious, right? Which is if reps know that they're going to lose the accounts, right, they're going to get way more aggressive on pipe gen. And the second bit, though, is the mere act of shuffling forces everyone to take a second look at the accounts. And, as a human, we're subject to irrational biases. So we may just say, this account is a bad account, but someone else gets it and they don't come in with that bias. And sure, some of them are legit bad accounts, but maybe the account you thought was bad wasn't. So I've definitely seen significant changes in bookings as a result of just the reshuffling.
Yeah, like on that note, on like sort of like energizing also like the sales team, like maybe like on a more tactical level, then how would you actually go about like rolling that out? With whom would you partner, right? So like RevOps, from the perspective of a RevOps person, basically like would you do it then sort of like with the sales managers? Would it be part of like after the QBR, or when is a good time and with whom do you do it?
Yeah, it is definitely a communicate early and often. Your RevOps leader are super involved. If you're a big enough company, you have someone who's solely responsible for territory. Really big companies have armies of people responsible for territory, right. but like, probably it's a RevOps leader. And then, yeah, to your point, you're working with, there's probably a first wave, which is working with the CRO and the CMO to make sure that you figure out what's the tier 1 target account list and that everyone's aligned on that. That doesn't happen enough, by the way, and sales ends up going after certain accounts and marketing ends up spending their ABX dollars on partially overlapping but not completely overlapping accounts. So I think that's a critical thing. And then there is the communication in regular team meetings with sales managers and even the reps. One thing, especially when you're developing an account scoring model, because I think that's the most sensitive in some ways piece of all this. When I've done this in the past, if a scoring model didn't exist and it wasn't just refining, we piloted first. So we took like a group of reps and built an algorithm to score the accounts and then showed the result to the reps and said, hey, does this make sense? And inevitably they're going to say, well, yeah, this is good, or this one is scoring high, but it shouldn't, or this one's low and it should be high, false positives and false negatives. And then you ask them, okay, well, why is it that account, should be higher or lower? And in the course of doing that with account scoring, the last time I did it, we found that one thing was, since we were selling sales software to salespeople, quite obviously the count of salespeople or the count of SDRs, right? The count of people in those types of roles really mattered. And 4 or 5 years ago, that stuff didn't exist. And I don't even know that it's super easy to come by even now. So we paid a third party to run queries on LinkedIn, like Boolean search queries, to figure out how many of each type of role was in the account. So once we added that data in and maybe a few other things, then the account scoring was there was like a breakthrough, right? And they're like, that one, yes. So that pilot phase to gain confidence with people who are, it's classic change management, right? Who are looked at by others as, the beacons in the organization is really, really valuable.
Yeah, super interesting. Makes a lot of sense. Can definitely relate to that, running Weflow. But another question, so you roll out the plan. How do you know that it's a good territory plan? I mean, what do you track? I mean, and you already alluded to this a bit, but and how do you know that it's not good?
Yeah, it's hard to know. And I'm trying to think, I have this vague sense in the back of my mind where, like, one time we rolled out a significant change and then rolled it back within, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks because it was pretty obvious pretty fast. I mean, I think you're gonna get the salespeople. Oh, now I remember what it was. It was we decided to split the U.S. into 3 pieces, into West, Central, and East. And the reps in the central part of the country immediately got upset, and justifiably so, because we were selling a B2B SaaS solution to mostly tech companies. Then people who are in the middle of the country are going to be disadvantaged, even if they have got like multiple states, right? So way back. So we went back to just splitting the country east and west down the middle, and so that was one where we knew it was bad, and we knew it was bad because the reps told us. I think that's probably the canary in the coal mine. The data could tell you also like pipe gen and win rates, but that takes a long time to actually be able to detect.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to, I mean, it's probably easy to find out that you were absolutely wrong, because then kind of your frontline will tell you very directly. But, obviously super interesting, because you're essentially focusing the whole organization on specific areas. Yeah. And so understanding whether the focus area is the right area is extremely interesting in my point of view. And I think it's really challenging to measure this quantifiably, right?
Yeah. I'd also add the other change that's more complicated is, as an organization grows, by necessity, the number of accounts per rep is going to shrink, right? So, at last count, I can't remember the exact number, but if you guys sell to people who have Salesforce, I think Salesforce has, call it 300,000 plus or minus accounts. Like that is the universe.
Yeah.
So if you have 1 rep, they have 300,000 accounts. If you have 2 reps, they have 150,000, and on and on and on, right? So I've worked in organizations where, reps started with 1,000, they moved into the hundreds of accounts, they moved down to tens of accounts ultimately, and then we had some strategic account reps who might have 1 or 2 accounts, right, where those accounts were a $5 or a $10 million account. And you could even go to the next extreme, which is, if you have a $10 million account, you probably don't just have 1 rep, you have a team focused on that account, assuming that there's significant expansion. So that's one where every time you cut territories to have fewer accounts, the reps are definitely going to grumble. They're definitely going to be upset, and you have to, like that one, you have to persevere through. And there can absolutely be a point where you've cut the territories too small. And I think that mistake has to be, at some point, is made no matter what. Like, eventually you've sliced it too small, but the only way I think you can really figure that out is to cut and cut and cut. Because generally smaller territories for a period of, it's like the same thing, the diminishing marginal return, and then the reverse, right? Is like, as you cut you actually, or the diminishing, what that, the early part is gains, right? Like it's incremental gains as you cut to smaller and smaller territories because of focus. So yeah, that's a tricky thing to manage.
Yeah. And would you basically reduce your TAM in the sales loft example by having good data on your competitors? So for example, saying, okay, look, I mean, you have these 3 competitors we always run into. We know they're on these accounts. We just reduce those. Or how do you deal with competitive scenarios? Because the data is sometimes hard to get by.
Yeah, the data's hard. I mean, we definitely, every job I've been in, we've tried to, where there was competitive, there's almost always a competitive account, right? Like there used to be 2 or 3 and now there's 20, right? If you're in the SaaS space, who all do the same thing. We would attempt to collect who is the competitor and when is the contract up, so that you could, you're nurturing the whole time, but you really intensify that in the last 6 to 9 months, especially if it's a multi-year contract, right? Like really start in earnest. If it's multi-year, you can probably, whichever, 6 to 9 months is probably the right window to really start to dig in. But you also just can't show up like 6 months before the renewal. You got to be showing up before then and cultivating the relationship. Yeah, we've tried to do that, but I think it ultimately, practically speaking, we did not adjust the TAM or the territory. We just knew that, within any rep's territory, X% was likely to be not in market, but still worth nurturing for the time when they are. And even if, I mean, I don't know that reps necessarily have this attitude or not, but the most positive sales organizations, it's like, if I know that some of my accounts are going to go to you, you know that some of your accounts are going to go to me, but as long as we're showing love, like it to the accounts, it should be a fair swap.
Yeah,
it should be.
Yeah. On that note, actually, wanted to get a bit deeper on that. So I think you alluded to a couple of like pitfalls that you can run into, and also like rolling things back when you realize, okay, it's probably not the perfect plan or wasn't the perfect plan. But sort of like this whole rules of engagement type of thing. So like theoretical example, right? Like Weflow is based in the EU. We have customers both in the US and in the EU. But let's say you have like a company, it's based in the EU. They buy your product, they buy your SaaS solution or whatever. And then they also have some teams in the US and in the UK and elsewhere, but those territories may be owned by a different sales team. How do you deal with that if like the original sale actually comes from the headquarter, and they are like kind of like taking care of the purchases and the purchase management, the whole procurement essentially? Yeah, like do you have an idea of how to solve for that?
I've done it different ways, right? So it's rules of engagement for international transactions on existing accounts or just even assigned accounts. So there's again a philosophical thing to start with, which is how do I define an account, and also how do I define account hierarchies between parents and parent-child. And most of what I've seen in smaller companies is basically I'm just going to assign based on the headquarters of the ultimate parent. So, Siemens in Germany or GE in the US, like the ultimate parent is headquartered in that particular place. And if the sales team is not huge, then that rep is just going to, basically do the transactions independent of the geography. Where things get tricky, of course, which is what you're alluding to, is like, okay, well, what if you need a rep in a different region to help out? And there it comes down to your cost of sale. If your cost of sale is relatively high, which is probably more the norm these days, what you're likely doing is a split. And there's no right or wrong answer, but maybe it's a 50-50 split to the rep who owns the account and to the rep in the other territory. So it could be, it could be different things, but I'm a big fan of just people live on expectations, or their happiness is determined by expectations, reps, happiness in particular. So as long as you're super clear, right, that when this happens, it's a 50-50 split, or, you're going to give credit in both places or whatever, I think it's fine. You could also do the other extreme, which I've seen too, which is like, and you can do this with the account assignment, which is you say these locations, right? D&B, for example, is great for this kind of account assignment. Is every Siemens location in Europe is going to be with rep A, and every Siemens location in North America is going to be with rep B, and you actually do the account assignment at the subsidiary level. I definitely appreciate what's probably going on in the back of people's minds, which is like, okay, the buyer is in Connecticut, but the approval is happening in Berlin.
Yeah.
Now what, right? Like, yeah, the stuff gets messy for sure. So I think it comes down to splits, and RevOps would often get, deeply involved in how those splits are determined.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We had an episode with Gabe Rothman about compensation planning, and one of like the key points that he made was also, like, hey, be transparent, be upfront with the reps that things, sometimes can get messy, and that you just need to be flexible around it, but we'll try to do our best with the best intention to make everyone happy. And so I would argue like it's probably like a good take here as well. Because I mean, this is just the reality.
Be transparent, be fair. Like the fairness extends not just to morale. The fairness is legal, right? Because if you treat one rep one way and another rep another way, right, they have a right to sue. And they don't usually do that on a 30K transaction, but there are definitely lawsuits against companies on, $5 million transactions up to, right? I mean, like a big company might, right, a Oracle or an IBM, SAP, whatever, right? Like they could do a $50 million deal, and then it becomes a very, very big issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair enough. Perfect, Jeremy. I think this is a perfect place to end. Suing and lawsuits. No, that shouldn't be the key takeaway, of course. More like the part we talked about before. We always ask our questions one final question, and that is like looking back at your career, what is something outstanding someone has done for you that has truly impacted your life?
Oh, I have so many. Because I'm nearing the end of my career. I mentioned one of those already, which was this in the business, on the business. I think it's sort of people seeing things in myself that I didn't see otherwise. The other one I guess I'd cite is I had a really significant career transition at Gartner at year 8 of the 16, where I moved from being an analyst into the business side. So, there was kind of a handful of people, the CEO, Gene Hall, my then boss, Nir Polonsky, 2 other guys, Ken Davis and Michael Yu, like that quadrumvirate, if that's a word. I don't even think it's a word, but like those 4 people heavily invested in me to move into like business strategy and operations when I didn't have the background. And, those 4 were all ex-McKinsey people, and they were hiring a lot of McKinsey people that they knew. So they took a flyer hiring me and coaching and training and developing me. And without that having happened, we wouldn't be on the phone today. I would be, I don't know what I'd be doing, but something probably still as an industry analyst of some kind.
Yeah, or working on semiconductors. Not the worst business to be in.
Yeah, not the worst. Well, if you're at NVIDIA, not the worst. Like right now, I think some of their competitors are not doing as well. But not the worst place to be.
Very true. Perfect. Jeremy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was awesome.